UNICEF reports that the number of children at risk of harm and abuse is closer to 1 billion. Can you define what harm and abuse children experience outside of safety and belonging?
Wow.
Dive right.
Yeah. And 1 billion children is a vast amount. I think it's about 50% of all children in the world, which is even more crazy.
It's scary, isn't it?
And the thing in terms of defining what is harm and abuse, sometimes that's defined in countries' legislation. That will be set out, and they will have those definitions as part of their Children Act or something similar. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child kind of defines that. But we kind of, categorise that into 5 categories of kind of sexual abuse to children, physical abuse, neglect, emotional harm, and also kind of emotional harm that's linked to domestic abuse. And abuse might be more than one category. And I think the issue as well is that harm might happen, but what we've also got to think about is the significance of that harm and the impact of that harm. So harm doesn't necessarily in itself mean that separation from a family. It might identify needs and how we support that family to address those issues, especially in categories like neglect and physical harm, not so much in terms of sexual abuse, where we would be more looking at an intervention to make sure that child's safe. But it might, in sexual abuse, be a case of abuse happening outside the family. So how do we help the family to kind of provide protection? So we're always looking at how do we protect children from harm, what can we do to support them? And it's only in those kind of extreme cases where we need to actually act to intervene.
Well, I think the numbers make that really clear. If you're saying that 1 billion is about 50% of children, there's no way you're going to remove 50% of children. That makes no sense. And so clearly we know that there's something going on there in terms of how we define it and when is the right time to take action and intervene, and when do we work to prevent harm and then to support rather than intervening. I think it is just such a big number. And I think also sometimes when we think about those different harms, different types of abuse or different types of harm, one of the things that is often overlooked is the physical impact, the developmental impact of things like neglect and emotional harm. I think we can easily understand that physical or sexual harm we can kind of get our heads around what that means, but unless you've had the training or had the background to really know the damage that can be done through neglect and emotional harm, it's easy to miss. It's easy to not understand the lifelong impact that can have on a child.
And I think as we progress and grow as a society, things are perceived differently. So I grew up many years ago as a child, and the culture then was very different to what it is now. And so children were basically seen as objects to do what you were told. And so there are deep-seated traditions that are set in here, and so how children were abused and neglected, and it wouldn't do them any harm. It would teach them, it'll teach them kind of a approach.
It can be complex to be able to work out what becomes harmful to the point of needing to intervene, and what we have to think about is the impact that intervention is going to have on that child. So it's not just there's harm, the solution is alternative placements of that children. We need to make that much more problematic and much more difficult, so actually few children are being removed, because otherwise we have 1 billion children needing alternative care. We're never going to be able to meet that need. So it's about how difficult we make it for children, so that only the children that really need alternative care, actually have to experience that.
And we have to understand too what the cultural differences are. And I guess I'm thinking particularly with neglect there, what we might consider neglect because of what we expect a child to have in one context might actually be different. And so what does neglect look like? And how do we define that? And I think there's lots of conversations that need to be had around those kinds of things to understand that what applies in one context is not always going to be correct for another context. And I think it's very easy for us to come in with our own perspective and say, oh, no, that's not right, without actually understanding the local context and knowing, what it looks like there, what safety looks like in that context.
Well, and we had a similar experience in Uganda, didn't we, where we saw a child-headed household. And part of our feelings...
What do you mean by, sorry,
to clarify? So child-headed household, children looking after themselves, and part of our feelings was that was so unusual for us. It was, we wanted to rescue them, but we knew from our professional background that's not actually what was going to work. And that what we needed to do was support them, and find ways to support them. And with that organisation, we used principles of foster care to help support child-headed households in their community so that they didn't have to be removed. That's also challenging because you're dealing with issues of significant poverty. But poverty shouldn't be the reason for removing children. Neglect is about where a carer is deliberately and maliciously withholding something from them, not the fact that they haven't got the latest technology or a nice comfortable bed or a very mixed diet.
And I think the really important thing too that you, in that situation that you were just talking about, is that the solution that came about in that particular situation was a local solution. It was one that was developed by the local workers.
With the local workers. We developed that with them, and I think that's the important thing. We didn't do it for them, we did it with them. And
because we would have different experiences from our home countries of what was appropriate in that context. And that's a really, it's just a central thing to be aware of.